Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Michelle James, and I am the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement here at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health. Today, we are excited to launch our new series created by our Rollins Alumni Board called Our Public Health Future Starts Now. The series will offer an opportunity for public health leaders and students to highlight advances in technology and data and consider how we use these advances to help shape the future of public health. In our first session today, we will discuss how public health can go beyond the status quo to embrace community-centered approaches to address future outbreaks, chronic health challenges, and even climate change using data, biotechnology, algorithms, and non-traditional partnerships. At this time, I'd like to introduce Niles Friedman, Rollins alumnus, current Rollins Alumni Board member, and the creator of this new series. Niles is a founding executive advisor with Star Insights, and specializing in creating and growing businesses, divisions, and core functions within organizations. He's built an adaptable approach to strategically collaborate across sectors, industries, and geographies through his work with startups, C-suite executives, public sector administrators, and nonprofit leaders. So Niles, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone. It's really great to be here in this first session as part of this new series. We want to dive right into the content. We have an amazing group of leaders and panel participants and topics, but I do want to quickly introduce David Bray, who's going to take us through this first session and was a bit of the brainchild behind this session today around data, biotech, and AI. David is a Rollins alum. He had a focus around public health informatics. He doesn't like a big bio, but I am going to acknowledge the amazing work that he is doing. He is a leader in global data, tech, bio, AI, and space ventures. That's just one area that he's focused on. He's a change agent. He's ranked in the top 1% for LinkedIn strategic executives. He's a CEO and board member. He's a pioneer, co-founder, senior consultant. And he's also a global speaker with Fortune 500 companies, the UN, and South by Southwest. And recently, this week, he was just sharing some amazing news about a new fellowship program that he's part of. So David has his arms and reach in so many areas. It's amazing to collaborate with a fellow Rollins alum on this first session, and just really excited to dive into the content. So with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Bray.
Well, thank you, Niles, for that very humbling introduction. And now I have to rise to the occasion. And I want to also give thanks to Michelle, to Rollins School of Public Health and Emory for hosting this. And this really is going to be sort of a collective conversation. We are also open to questions as we go through this from the audience, because as we know, the world is changing rapidly as a result of multiple new technologies simultaneously. Niles, you made me sound sort of like a quantum particle where I need to occupy many different places at once. Public health itself is facing the challenges of what do we do about data and AI? What do we do about evolutions in biology and what we can do with biotech? What do we do about the changing sort of nature of how we work with communities? That communities now can expect more interactions and things that just were not possible, say, 20 or 25 years ago when people did not have access to some of these technologies. So this is going to be a bold adventure together. And I'm really excited to welcome two longtime friends and colleagues. They're some of the best people in the world that I know. And so to join them for the conversations, I'm first going to go to a longtime friend and collaborator, Natalie Barrett, who has done multiple things in the biospace, multiple things for the good of both the United States and the world, and is really a deep thinker and doer in these topics. She's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, so giving a salute to that institution as well. Nat, as I go to you, why is it so important that we think about how public health is changing in the face of evolutions and technological revolutions when it comes to data, bio, and algorithms?
Well, David, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here. This is a very important topic. The world is changing very quickly. I think about, as a scientist, the importance of having impactful and meaningful and validated data to even start to assess where we are. And today we're in a unique place because I have more personal health information available to me than I've ever had before. And that's just me. The challenge is my data is distributed across hospitals that I visit, doctors, clinics, imaging, pharmacies, fitness trackers, Verizon, right? And so we're at this very unique place for designers and for decision makers. We have an opportunity to leverage data that we haven't before. And a hat to David's background, he's looked at other global health indicators, non-traditional health indicators, things like purchase data for garlic or cold and flu medication. And then the presence of shoppers at big box stores like Walmart from Earth observation data that can equate business health to community health because they're out and about. And then you think about the advancements in data storage, things like cloud databases. I could rattle the 5 different commercially available data sets that I have access to, clouds, including Google. Google has all my data, right, where I've been. Apple, they can find my phone. Verizon, I didn't even ask them to store my images, but they did. And Amazon has all my purchase information. And so if we start to think about these different pieces of data, and then move to think about analytics. You know, when ChatGPT came out, we were like, AI, most people. What is AI? Can I use AI? Is AI going to change the world? No, it's an algorithm, but it is now accessible and it's advancing quickly. And we don't just have machine learning algorithms that can detect like, hey, Nat's smiling or Nat's panicked or Nat's sick today. She looks very pale. But we also have the advancement of interactive AI that can identify the status of my health and potentially recommend to me that maybe I need a doctor, or maybe I need to be talked through how to provide self-treatment because I am far, it notices I'm far from a hospital. Maybe it places an order for me to receive some needed food or water. And I would love for it to send an Uber to an ailing parent to pick them up for their follow-up doctor's appointment. And even if they could schedule it for me. And you think about how robust our IT infrastructure is today, not just in 5G for us in the United States, but globally available, even in satellite provided broadband to, the remote areas of the world. And Megan's going to get into things like biofoundries. My background in the Human Genome Project and COVID dashboards and COVID sensors has really gotten me to appreciate the value of biofoundries, the ability to basically assess what vaccine, what cancer treatment we might use, and to recognize that we don't have to do it for the whole world from one place. Our supply chain during COVID taught us that was a bad plan. So instead, let's figure out how to work together to put up these different foundries and to provide the tools needed, the therapies needed, the therapeutics needed at the point of care. We talk about cyber biosecurity and the advancement of blockchain, another one of David's areas of expertise, and the ability to validate that a process was followed and adhered to so that you can be confident, not just in the protocol, but in the item produced on the other end. And so the last thing I'll say is that standards are important. They've not really been developed. Thank goodness the CDC is working hard at it, but they need each of us to step up and really contribute. That's why it matters today for me, David.
well, Nat, you dropped the mic. That was a boom goes the microphone moment. So that was great because there was a lot there. And I'm going to ask a real quick rejoinder before I go to Megan, because I think what you did was what public health does best. It's about systems of systems of humans and communities, but also thinking about this evolving data landscape, ubiquitous computing, and more. As you look to it, if you were to sort of issue a grand challenge, that we think about? And I know this is, I'm asking you on a moment, so if you want, we can circle back, but what is one or two grand challenges that you think would be wonderful for not just the CDC, because you made the note, it's CDC plus us. We cannot look to a centralized solution to save this. And that's what public health does best, is it's distributed. So what would be one or two grand challenges you might issue? And then I'm going to go to Megan for her drop the microphone moment as well. Over to you, Nat.
Sure. And so on the grand challenges, I issue two recommendations. One is to get to know people in disparate areas of expertise that you don't know. If I said a term that you were like, I have no idea what she just said, write it down, ask someone, build those relationships, because it's the cross-disciplinary solutions that are going to change our future. The other is get to know someone who actually needs point of care every day. For me, the ability to have to be part of the sandwich generation and caretake a parent has completely opened my eyes to the reality of what is needed. I also have a sibling who has severe immune issues. And so appreciating what these people need daily and how this technology can completely change their lives is important. I'm going to issue a third one, David.
Sure.
And that is to start to think through how you would want your data handled. Right? We're thinking about grabbing all of this data, and we need to, but how do you use it in a way that is respectful of each of us, that reminds us that we each have inherent worth individually and collectively?
I love it. The three that you put forward, it's sort of, you talked about first, make sure you have the literacy to understand what the tech can do and how it can be applied. And then you said, make sure it's actually tied to a use case, a mission that helps. And it's recognizing that we've all become caregivers of a sort, both through the pandemic, but also, as you mentioned, I'm similarly like you, is that we're caring for, whether it's for elder care, sibling care, family care. And then finally, you tied it to make sure we still value the dignity of people and make sure that we do with the data values that dignity as well. So with that, one, thank you, Nat. And Megan, you now have a very hard bar to follow, but I note that you have an impressive real world background that I think will help with captivating, sort of the rainbow of perspectives you're going to be bringing to us. Megan, if you could first share us a little bit about your background and why, and from your perspective, it is so essential that we think about opening the aperture for what public health considers when it comes to data, bio, and algorithms.
Thanks so much. And so first of all, thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I am feeling a little bit under the weather today, which reminds me how important health is the foundation for everything that we can do individually and collectively in this society. I wanted to mention I'm largely speaking in my personal capacity today, but it's motivated by a couple different roles that I hold right now. The first is Senior Director of Public Impact at Ginkgo Bioworks, which I'll mention in a little bit more about in a second. And the second is an adjunct professor of bioengineering at Stanford University. And this work in my role have really been motivated by the need to guide innovations in biotechnology, in particular to meet pressing public needs in and beyond the domain of health directly, although again, I would argue everything is connected to health at the end of the day. So I think today's topic is important, and the bio angle, as well as its intersections with data in particular, is that right now there's really dramatic advances in biotechnology that are enabling us to work in very different ways to meet these pressing global challenges. So some of you may be new to synthetic biology as a topic. You can think about synthetic biology as the tools and the knowledge that are enabling us to actually engineer biology. So being able to read and write and edit the code of life at a speed, scale, and level of precision that we really have never seen before. And some of these challenges, some of these changes are really causing paradigm shifts in our governance needs. So practically, when we're able to digitize much of our biology, it means we can actually organize ourselves differently when we're not tied to physically working in the same space as the biology that we are studying. And so my own background is actually first as a systems engineer and as a chemist. So that systems thinking, I think, pervades this panel. But when I did my PhD in immunology and in bioengineering, it largely involved the practice of having to pipette liquids around. And now sort of the modern bioengineer is able to use often armies of robots and conduct in many ways fewer experiments because of the predictive capacity that we are quickly gaining by accumulating more and more biological data. So we're doing more of our work sort of in silico. One of the things I studied at Stanford and continue to work on is how we think about risks, especially from pandemics and sort of biological threats writ large. And so what this means, for instance, is that reading and writing the code of viruses means that, we can sequence something in one part of the world. We don't need to necessarily ship that across the world. And so it, again, is that paradigm shift from the problem being one of technology to one of being around governance. And so it's really around how we organize to ensure that the innovations are safe and effective. And then it also begins to think about the equities that are involved in that type of work. I did think it might be useful to talk a little bit about Ginkgo, for those of you who may not know it, especially because Natalie mentioned biofoundries. So Ginkgo Bioworks is the world's leading synthetic biology company. It's 15 years old. It was started by some of my friends who I went to grad school with. And 2 years ago, it was the largest biotech IPO in history. So we're actually listed in the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker DNA. But in speaking about foundries, it's a really sort of large spaces with lots of robots and informatics that helps to support biological experiments. And we've built out over 300,000 square feet of this foundry to enable us to program cells as a service to folks who are working in areas like pharma, so Merck, Biogen, and more, but also areas like big chemical companies like Solvay, Sumitomo, and others, as well as ag companies like Bayer and Syngenta. And as a result of this sort of platform for being able to engineer biology, we're currently designing more DNA than anyone in the world. And that's sort of crazy to think about. But what that means is, we're getting better and better at how we organize not just organisms, but all of the data combined across them to really understand how living systems work. We also have work that we do in biosecurity in particular. So while governments are looking to synthetic biology tools to boost manufacturing and solve pressing problems, they're also looking at how they both deal with extant threats from biology as well as emerging threats. And so we work with partners to be able to basically do biological attribution, but also develop increasingly a biological radar system that's able to detect biological threats all over the world, and in the dream be able to tie that back to very quick responses. And so how do we improve that capacity? We need to develop the types of informatics tools that can help to support that work. And so we very recently announced a new deal with Google Cloud that enables us to leverage AI capabilities in new and powerful ways, although we've been using those tools for a while. So why do I think this is important? The world's changing. It's the end of the beginning in some ways for bioengineering and biotechnology, and this will change our lives, all of our lives for decades to come. And so we really need leaders that can help to anticipate and solve many of the challenges we're going to face as we organize differently.
Excellent. Well, thank you again. You definitely rose to the occasion, Megan. And if I could ask you a real quick rejoinder before I circle back and we start to explore three aspects of the what associated with what we could do here. If you could real quick, you've done a lot with iGEM. So if you could explain to our audience what iGEM is, and then if you are open to it, brainstorming a little bit about how iGEM might intersect with public health and how we might actually be able to link what iGEM does with public health. But maybe first explain to our audience what iGEM is.
Well, David, you're asking one of my favorite questions because I love iGEM. So iGEM is the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. It might be new to you, please look it up. But when I was in high school, I was able to participate in a robotics competition called First Robotics. And we were given a kit of parts, or electrical and mechanical parts, and invited to design a robot that played a game. And in this case, I'm Canadian, so that robot had to play hockey, of course. And you know, we got, I think, second to last place, but it was a transformational experience in realizing I could actually engineer something from these parts. Now, iGEM was inspired by that concept 20 years ago now at MIT. But instead of mechanical electrical parts, it was small pieces of DNA that could perform biological functions and be put together. And the design challenge was not to compete against another organism, which would be a bad idea, but rather use biology to solve an important problem. So it was an open-ended design challenge. And so that competition has gone from 5 teams in 2005. It was a class originally in 2003. And this year, iGEM will celebrate its 20th anniversary, in which we will have hundreds of teams from dozens of countries come together now in Paris to celebrate their innovations. And so a large number of those teams, which are largely undergraduate, but increasingly high school students as well, are working in problems around health directly and indirectly, right? So they're working on everything from how do we use these innovations to develop new therapies, new diagnostics, but also how do they mitigate, again, extent risks, including from climate change and others. And for me, that's been a great source of inspiration to see what happens when you develop the tools and the communities and critically the culture that support innovation in all of these areas, and also support, you know, exchanging data and tools. So each of the iGEM teams contributes a new tool and they give their data to others to build upon. So it's this collective enterprise of being able to build that up. And it's worth mentioning the company that I now work for was really its genesis was in this competition. And so we're trying to bring that same spirit, but to innovation in the private realm.
Excellent. Well, so now we get to the part where we sort of begin to explore the what. And I would again invite, if the audience does have any questions, put them in the chat, and I will try to include them in the conversations we're having. I'm going to go first to Nat. And I really want to think, as we think about what can be done in this space, because it's so big, it's so huge, we probably could easily have multiple series on this topic alone, and we want to make it accessible, so we're not. Think of 3 C's, and the 3 C's being both the commons when it comes to the digital commons, whether it's data or information about our behaviors. I mean, I know, Nat, you mentioned the non-obvious signs that something's going wrong, because in a past life, we knew about the original coronavirus, SARS, both through the increase in the price of garlic, but also increased reflectivity of cars around parking lots, which was observable from space. And so we preserved privacy, but it was a signal. So think about the digital commons. That's the first C. The second C is thinking about climate, because now climate and public health increasingly are intersecting Venn diagrams. And we know, for example, that there are displaced people as a result of either lack of water, lack of food, that then can create public health conditions and create more. And so thinking about climate. And the final C is, of course, community, because I think that's what public health does best. If I could distinguish between what public health does versus medicine by itself, it reminds us that no person is an island, that we all work together. So in that context, Nat, if you could put forward sort of both things you're seeing as well as things that you would sort of want to see public health tackle when it comes to the commons, climate, and community.
That's great. So in the commons, something that I would love to see at universities in particular, and I'm curious to find out if Megan has already seen this or if Emory has started to do this, but to set up biofoundries. And to really start to test out the distributed manufacturing across your campuses, because one of the biggest challenges is setting those standards, and we don't know what the standards should look like because this is an emerging market. And so you think about a university, it's a really well-positioned place to experiment and to push forward policy. especially to our policymakers that are trying to consider what it should look like. I love the climate question. I'm actually pretty darn passionate about our climate and how we can preserve it, because it is our environment. It's where we live. And so trying to also look at some of the NOAA imagery that's publicly available, information about the different pollutants that are in our community, and to start to work to correlate that potentially to our own PHI, personal health information, and our community's health information. There's been some work in an organization called Climate Trace, and what they have done is to start monitoring how much pollution is in our cities. And I bring that up because when you think about what happened in COVID, yes, it was disruptive, but it was a time for the earth to actually have a chance to be resilient and heal. We saw dolphins in Venice, right? We were able to see Kilimanjaro from 125 miles away. And you know, I think it's important to recognize that the climate provides plenty of indicators about public health. When we had the forest fires in Canada, people in New York City, ironically, were no longer taking their masks off to get out of the subway. They were putting them on when they got out of the subway because of the amount of pollutants and dust and ash that were present. And so recognizing that those indications and warnings are critical to supporting our public health. And then community. You know, public health is only valuable if it's adopted by community. We saw this in COVID. People were afraid of vaccines. It was a new vaccine. We did something remarkable to produce those vaccines in record time with mRNA, something new. And of course, anything new is scary. And so it's very important to ensure that people understand and are educated so that they can take up the next vaccine, use the next cancer biopharmaceutical, purchase the right agriculture materials that are going to help provide nitrogen back to the soil. You know, whenever I think about community within my own family, and you might think about it in yours, people would come to me and say, Nat, is this safe? What do you think? And it's hard to recognize, but we are each not just a sensor, but also a community member that people look to for guidance. And so making sure that people in your own sphere are educated, but whenever possible on a global scale.
Love it. And I think you did a very good job of linking those three topics together about also our responsibility to bringing knowledge to the community and being knowledgeable of the community, which I think will tie into a question that we've got from Taylor Moore that I'll circle back to after I first go to Megan for her thoughts. And so Taylor, we'll get to your question in a second. If other folks have questions, please put them in so I can include them. Megan, over to you as well for your thoughts about what are things that either are being done or we should be doing when it comes to the commons, the climate, as well as communities.
Thanks, David. Love a good alliteration. So, there's so much in here to discuss. A few things I wanted to highlight. When it comes to the commons, it's still important to remember, even though we talk about having all of this data that's fueling different types of models, in many domains, we are still relatively data poor. And as Natalie highlighted, you know, the sort of structure of this data matters. It matters in terms of not only sort of the form of the data, but also the overall architecture of the way that data is brought together and who governs it and who controls it. I think a lot about this in of course, the biological domain. And I mentioned before that we design more DNA than any other organization. And with this, one of the reasons we're investing in these new types of AI capabilities is we have at Ginkgo Bioworks the largest sort of private biological data set that can be combined with other types of public data sets. And the grand challenge of actually how do we structure organizations to be able to collect the types of data, but critically derive value from that data is not trivial, right? And how do you think about innovation ecosystems that are able to meet all those design constraints of, again, needing to protect the data in meaningful ways? And also, how do you critically think beyond the human, right? So what's fascinating about biology is, like, you know, we're just one species. There's so many more species out there. Biology predates us. It has invented so many things, and it's out there for us to discover. And I don't think we have the right types of organizational structures right now that are really able to, again, harvest and leverage that data. So it is important to think about those protections. We need to critically think about how do we connect them to value in innovations, in understanding our world, our own biology, and the biology of the greater biosphere of which we are a part. I think this is a subject that actually deserves a lot of scholarly attention and connection to real world practice. And something I'm quite passionate about. And that does, of course, relate to climate, right? One of the impacts of climate change is that, and other activities, is that, you know, again, we're losing the most valuable data set. All of these innovations, the biology has already evolved. And we need to be developing the capacity to learn from and preserve and protect that biology, because it is our greatest asset. So one of the activities that I also help support is I'm on the board of an organization called Revive and Restore, which is a nonprofit that is focused on biotechnology in order to, again, bring biodiversity preserve biodiversity and ideally enrich that biodiversity. And so we've been working on a lot of projects around biobanking all around the world. And it's, again, not a trivial challenge to figure out how do you collect not just data. In many cases, we need actually physical samples of this data of biology in order to be able to understand and ideally not have to bring back, but in some cases bring back those species. So there have been some really interesting stories to look at. For instance, the black-footed ferret was cloned from cells frozen down at the San Diego Zoo over 30 years ago. And it's a really inspiring story about having foresight on the types of investments we need to make for the future, given a changing planet. And that comes to really back to community. I think we really need to think boldly about the types of global, so very hyper-local and all the way spanning to local organizations that can contend with these types of challenges. Things like iGEM we mentioned before have been very inspiring to me because they teach us that, you know, great innovations can happen locally, but then when we come together in new and interesting ways, we have a lot to learn from each other. So David and I most recently worked together, for instance, on a global future council in synthetic biology, working with the World Economic Forum, that tried to have that same inspiration as the iGEM students, but with the grown-ups. Ends up grown-ups are a lot more difficult to work with, but it's certainly, there's inspiring opportunities in that space.
I love it, Megan, and absolutely, as one who has done U.S. federal government, yes, the grown-ups make it difficult. But anyway, so with that said, I also love that what you put forward, which is there actually are some cases where we have data scarcity, and that's something that we need to think about. But we also have an urgency of time, which is, you know, we don't want to lose what life has done. And so I think that's going to be something that we're going to circle back as we go to part 2 of the what's. But I'm going to go first to Taylor's question. And Niles, I'm going to put you on notice, and I'm actually going to come to you first on this question. So get ready to get off mute, because Taylor's question basically said that Taylor's an alum from the MHP, Masters of Public Health program, that worked in the infectious disease space. And they want to be getting into the bioinformatics and biotech space. And their question questions are, what can we do to sort of gain more knowledge without having to get a second master's or PhD? I'm going to put forward one idea, and then I'm going to be interested, Niles, if you have thoughts as a fellow Rollins alumni, and then Megan and Nat, if you want to chime in as well. I think this points to the reality is we need to be lifelong learners. And I agree. You know, going back to take the time to get a second master's or PhD, that's only going to be for certain people. And so maybe what we need is a co-evolution. In fact, I might even issue a challenge to Emory, because my undergrad was computer science, my master's was public health informatics, and my PhD was in a business school. At the time, people didn't understand why I was doing it, but in hindsight, it makes sense. Maybe we actually need to have a collective continuing education that spans not just the School of Public Health, but other domains at Emory, because this is bringing together so many different domains, and make it so that it could be come in just for one course that's delivered to you virtually through podcast or something like that, that you can listen to your way from work, coming back from work, or if you do enough of them, it could actually get you a certificate. But the idea is that, you know, we know you're busy, and if anything, sometimes the best way I have found is to be working simultaneous to seeking knowledge, because you see the connections in the knowledge. I think there's value in that. And so I'd issue it as an interesting challenge to think about, what does continuing education look like, not just in public health, but public health plus other disciplines, be it AI or business. However, Niles, as promised, I'm going to go to you to see what thoughts you have as well.
Yeah, those are great ideas, David. I love the practical sort of application into sort of coursework and sort of giving people that level of resources. I would say yes and to that, and say, this is a really great question, Taylor, because this has come up in multiple activities and panel discussions that we've had for alum. So you're an Epi MPH grad. Think about the core skills that you have. And I don't know if you work in the public sector or the private, but public sector skills with an Epi background are really attractive in the private sector, right? Do you lead with your Epi skills? That's TBD. But the ability, if you want to get into bioinformatics and biotech, how do you distill the work that you've done with your Epi background and translate that to, let's say, private sector biotech companies that absolutely want your skill set and want your expertise and the ability to connect in with public health? So there's so many sort of value adds that you bring beyond the core skills. There's a public health vision and looking at infectious disease. That's something that is not going to be maybe as applicable to someone who might have a more traditional sort of private sector tech background. So one, I think you're very marketable. Two, I think it's also, how do you translate your core skills into, let's say, the private sector biotech space? The second idea I would say is, I've found this personally, is think, and this kind of goes to David's sort of theme of his response, is think about fellowship programs. Think about work opportunities that maybe aren't a full-time W-2 with an organization, a firm, a biotech company, et cetera. There are so many ways to engage in doing practical work, let's say for a year or two in a fellowship capacity, that give you then the opportunity to sort of test out, right? So you're not going back and getting another master's or PhD, which definitely there's definitely value to that, but you're getting like practical work experience in this kind of limited capacity. One example that I can speak to is a nonprofit called Fuse Corps, which pairs up mid-level execs to cities, counties, and states, and bringing in that level of expertise to support and complement. It's not all public health, but a big area is around public health, social programs, social services. So it's a one-year fellowship program. I did this with the state of California about 10 years ago, and it was a game changer for me and thinking about like where I wanted to focus in my sort of work, having an MPH. So I think one, think about how to sort of define your skills with your Epi background, very marketable. And then two, there's just a plethora of opportunities to do fellowships for like 1 to 2 years where you gain this experience, and then it gives you sort of a roadmap to move forward. But yeah, I love this question.
And that was, I think, very helpful. And I would also amplify what you said, Niles, because I saw Michelle just chimed into the chat that actually Rollins is actually looking at several of these things. And so for those who cannot see the chat, if you go to strategic plan, all one word, .sph.emory.edu, again, strategic plan as one word, .sph.emory.edu, more information can be found there. I'm now going to actually sort of add to this question when I go to Nat and to Megan, because there's the elephant in the room, which is AI, which is currently the zeitgeist of the day, both a lot of hype and fear, but there's also some things there. And I love, Nat, how you said earlier in your opening remarks that let's recognize it's algorithms. and algorithms have been here. And let's remember, AI is actually 65 plus years old. It started in the 50s. So it's just this current thing called large language models has captivated everybody's interest. But whether you call it clinical decision support systems, expert systems, before that, natural language processing and more, I mean, it's had many different instantiations. So as we look to this, I actually was having a conversation today with a executive at a AI entity that will remain nameless to preserve their integrity. But they were raising the issue that right now with AI in healthcare, they're seeing a trend to more very specific, almost biomolecular applications. That while there are larger individual and community healthcare, everyone's a little risk averse because generative AI, we haven't figured out, like, how do we handle those hallucination things? I'm also going to give a shout out to a friend and colleague, Professor J.P. Singh, who is also a friend of Nat and Megan, who at a different institution, but we respect that institution, George Mason, was part of a team that recently looked at 54 different national AI strategies. Because yes, there are currently 54 different national AI strategies, and found overwhelmingly they omitted talking about AI in health. So great, there's an opportunity as well as a crisis here. As we go there, I'm going to go first to Nat and then to Megan. If right now there is some hesitancy to think about AI and health because we haven't figured out the limitations and the messiness of doing this both with individuals and communities, and at the same time, policymakers haven't sketched out ideas. Again, if you were president for the day or prime minister for the day, what would you sort of suggest as a strategic way forward, Nat? And then I'll go to Megan on the same question.
It's a great question, David, and I really appreciate it because, you know, I think many of us are worried that generative AI is going to give AI a bad name, mostly because of the data set that it has had access to. Mm-hmm. And full transparency, it's had access to all of our data, which is not necessarily validated or accurate or the truth or however you want to define that, but it's not rigorously assessed or tested. And so the beauty of generative AI is that if you put it in a box and it is actually accessible to validated data, to data that you have tested and confirmed this is accurate, and you give it a protocol that is equally validated and accurate, now you have a robust solution. Now, do I think that you should ever just let it run? Absolutely not. We're here. We have humans. We have brilliance and we can check it, right? Everything should be validated. Just because my calculator tells me a number, I second guess it. I make sure it's approximately accurate. And it should be no different with generative AI. But it is highly valuable, right? If I have those two controlled data sets, and now let's say I would love to give generative AI access to my controlled personal health information, combined with all of my labs and images and fitness information, and even information about where I've been and what I might have been exposed to in a particular location, whether it's pollutants or people had an outbreak that were also co-located with me in my travels, to be able to provide recommendations about future tests I should take or ways to optimize my health. Because fundamentally the information is there. It just hasn't been personalized to me. And the same thing at the community level. There's no reason why this doesn't move to the broader, larger communities and eventually globally.
Well said. And I love how you say, be aware of what the machine can and cannot do, and also recognize that in some respects, the machine is only as good as the data it's trained upon. And I love that. And also the agency of your choice, as opposed to it being done without your awareness and being sort of essentially opaque. I think that is so key, Nat. And so maybe Megan, if you're open to also tackling this question from your perspective, we see hesitant. I mean, in some respects, good news. They're more than happy to use AI for proteins and molecules, but how do we lift up and consider the larger individual and community aspects and where AI plus bio could play a role? Over to you, Megan.
Thanks. There's so many good questions here. I thought I'd start with Taylor's question a little bit more directly and then expand to AI. as somebody who's still a professor and loves education, I think that practical experience is very valuable in order to shape the right types of questions that you bring back to further studies if you so choose, or maybe then go teach. And I think there's a ton you can do at a master's level. And certainly, while Ginkgo is, I would argue, somewhat unique, we do have, for instance, teams that are coming from epi and a master's in public health within the company that are now working with our biotechnologists to figure out how do we develop the leading capabilities for biosecurity globally. And so I have many of my greatest colleagues are using that skill set. And I would argue that this is growing and really needed. Our biosecurity business unit is called Concentric. It was originally stood up during the pandemic as K-12 testing, but has then gone on to say, what else can we do around the biosecurity space, including in understanding deterrence, again, with attribution, so being able to use biotechnology knowledge and tools to understand the potential origins of biological threats, but also how do we interface, right, existing public health infrastructures to, again, attend to these types of emerging threats. And so we need those types of expertise. I would also say again, my expertise is a little bit more in what is discussed as biosecurity, but often that is really sort of public health and pandemic preparedness and other forms and other words. And my colleagues and I, working across a wide variety of organizations in academia, in nonprofits, in government, in industry, are speaking about the great demand for talent in this space. And often what we are looking for is exactly folks who probably come from a master's level and who also have that type of practical management skills that are able to, again, can, as David said, can are great at learning to learn and can help to bridge many different types of expertise and communities. So I don't know you personally, but I suspect you're very well set up to be in this domain. I wanted to mention the one fellowship in particular that I think is notable in this area is the Emerging Leaders in Biosecurity Initiative, run by Hopkins, but there are others as well, and there's a really great growing community in that space. And when it comes to AI, I would say, again, I come from places that are generally not risk averse, who we're interested, or not risk averse in terms of we see the risk of inaction as being one of their greatest risks, and trying to figure out how do we move forward boldly and with care for leveraging new tools and capabilities to meet global needs. And so just as one example, at Stanford, when I'm still an adjunct professor, we have a human-centered AI initiative, and they've been focusing a lot on the infrastructure to support health needs in particular, and working with some of our colleagues in public health. And so I think that we need more people who bring that bold perspective and that careful perspective on how to bring these tools to bear to solve these challenges.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that, Megan. And we are getting to about the remaining 14 minutes mark. And so I'm going to address one additional question we got from an anonymous attendee who asked a question of strategy. We'll keep it short. And then sort of from there, we'll go to the lightning round. And so I'm going to go first to Megan and then to Nat, and then we'll do the lightning round, which was who sets the strategy for public health? And maybe in some respects, this is a question that realizes maybe it's not any one institution or any one organization can do it, that we are the cavalry and we've got to work across sectors. However, I'm going to you, Megan, because I know we've chatted in the past and you alluded to it, some in your remarks. We're going to need new forms of governance. We're not saying governments, but governance. And so maybe on your thoughts about how do you work across private sector, public sector, individual members of the communities themselves, and the public across nations, because IGEM does work across multiple nations. And so thoughts on strategy and governance in this evolving domain.
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult topic, but sometimes, we're asking who's developing the strategy. And it's fairly rare that there's actually like a well-baked strategy, and then there have been many well-baked strategies that never get done.
Right.
And so I think focusing on like what are the unique skills and capabilities that you or as an individual or as an organization you work with can bring to this challenge is where it matters. What can you do? One of the things we think about as a company is, yes, we're just one company, but we're a bunch of nerds who care a lot, and we're like, one of the things we can do is we do need governance needs, but we also need new technologies to support the types of ways that we need to govern. And so there's technical capabilities that also intersect with this. Another thing that biology teaches us is that stuff grows. And so don't be afraid to start small in this case, right? iGEM started as a class at a university, and all of a sudden it's 20 years later, and the WHO is calling iGEM to learn from its horizon scanning capabilities in this space. Or, how do you learn from the kids who are now grown-ups on how to think differently about how we could organize. So I think the key is not having paralysis in the name of strategy, but also thinking about, in many cases, we are hindered by not questioning the assumptions that underlie the way that we operate today. And again, this not accounting for the risk of inaction.
Very well said. And I love in particular, like you said, make sure whenever one's thinking about the way forward, go back to why are we here and what's our understanding of the world, because it may have changed. And like you said, sometimes trying to get a perfect strategy or fear of not having a perfect strategy is actually worse, because you got to move forward boldly and bravely, but also with the benevolence to say, we're going to learn along the way and be attentively listening. So I really appreciate that, Megan. Nat, I'm going to go to you for similar thoughts, and then we will bring it home for the lightning round, unless either Niles or Michelle has anything they want to add before we go to lightning round. But first to you, Nat, on your thoughts about strategy and governance.
Yeah, I think the important piece about strategy and governance is that we all implement it. Our desire to have these conversations, to put out papers, to write blogs, to solicit our leaders, we are creating that governance structure. It's a lot to bear, but if you want to get involved, you just simply have to start communicating what that governance structure should be. Yes, the CDC exists. Yes, the World Health Organization exists. But they're collectives of people who are looking for your ideas. So if you have ideas, many of them have ways for you to provide and solicit your ideas. I would encourage you to be brave and courageous enough to share them.
Very well said. And I appreciate it, Nat. And like you said, it's on us. We are the cavalry. We could easily have Niles and Michelle a future series that actually talks about both taking positive action and being bold, as well as I see in some of the questions, there's people asking about how do you deal with misinformation, disinformation, health space, but that would go too long. So I'm going to try and tie this with a bow and now go to the lightning round. For those not familiar, this is where we put forward 2 to 3 sort of bite-sized steps forward, recognizing the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single few steps. I'm going to go first to Nat and then to Megan. If you were to put forward how we move forward with benevolence, brave, and boldness in this future ahead, when it comes to thinking about the future of public health as it relates to data, bio, and algorithms, Nat, what would you prescribe?
I would prescribe 3 things: that we get connected, that we get creative, and that we are courageous. And being connected, I mean that we are connected to our communities, that we actually look for our CHI, our community health information, that we're aware of what it is, where it is. You at least know the information about probably how many emergency beds are occupied at any time. You likely can find out when there is a run on a particular drug or vaccine in your area. There are plenty of indications and warnings, but get to know what they are and understand what's missing. Get to understand what diagnostic protocols exist, what data is validated and what's not. And be creative, to think out of the box, way out of the box, to include disciplines and perspectives that you don't normally appreciate. Not many of us have thought about Earth observation data as having something to do with public health, and yet it's critical. And then I encourage you to be courageous. Be willing to fail, learn, and know that the build, design, test, learn process is critical for designers because it requires us to be courageous, to look at our failures, and to create that future that we would all like to experience.
Loving that. And I loved how you put forward the idea of CHI being community health information. I think that's a powerful metaphor. I also like how you put forward the idea of failing as being a part of learning. And I like to remind people that it's actually an acronym. They just never told you. First attempt at iterative learning. There'll be a second, third, and fourth attempt. Real failure is only not learning on these different iterations, that we have to learn because the world is changing so much and we have to do that together. So Megan, once again, I apologize for putting you in the situation of having to rise to that high bar that Nat set for you, but what are your thoughts on the action steps we could do going forward, Megan?
Well, I'm going to be largely biased about the topics that I care the most about.
That's fine. You're allowed to be.
And reiterate many of the points I've made before. So first, I think it's important in this space to learn about the developments in biotechnology and synthetic biology. That right now there's a lot of attention to AI in particular, but advances in this space are moving very quickly. They will affect all of our lives, and for me, it is just so cool. They're like very, very inspiring. And as part of that, sort of ask questions about what's happening in this space and be informed. I mean, we are, it's easy to forget that like we're all made of biology. Often it seems like an abstract thing, but in some ways it's the thing that is the most immediate and most foundational. Like Natalie said as well, my second topic is just, we have to think, we talk about thinking boldly, but what does that actually mean? I mean, in practice, one of the reasons I've greatly valued my friendship with you, David, and with you, Natalie, is finding, finding people who are willing to be just very curious, and again, keep asking those questions about the assumptions that underlie a lot of the ways that we work today. It is actually fairly rare. I think that in many cases where, we just assume that everybody else is, must be smarter than us and they must have it figured out, but in many cases they don't. And we need to be willing to just acknowledge that we don't know how to think about this. And so there's many domains, and the domain of sort of AI and bio, or whatever names you put on it, is an area where in many cases we do not have experts, and we actually need to bring together communities that are asking each other how you work in this space, and again, not be fearful of inaction. I think that's one of our biggest risks. And third, and this is related to this, but when we think about the threats we face, and I've been thinking a lot about pandemics for a long time. We do need to figure out how we account for the risks of inaction, in many different domains. And so I would really think about that not as a way to sort of make excuses for doing reckless things, but rather thinking about what's it going to cost if we don't change the way we work today.
Very well said. And what I love about that is you actually sort of unpacked what it means to be bold. And it's both a combination of curiosity, but also to collaborate with others, because none of us have all the answers. And then again, to your point, Megan, that you said about recognizing that we cannot maintain the status quo. And so that is not necessarily an excuse to be reckless, but to really sort of always be learning and engaging. And really what we want, and that's what I celebrate about public health, is it is community engagement with different communities. And it is always recognizing and learning that we go with a hypothesis about what we're seeing, but as the data and what we hear from the community and the voices say, we may update that. And so that is so key. So now that's been our conversation for the day. I'm going to turn it back to Niles and Michelle in a moment, but I will end with one benediction to consider as we move forward with courageousness and benevolence in this future ahead, which is, again, textbooks are not written, as Megan said. There is actually a lack of expertise here, only because these things haven't been done. They're hard. And at the same time, that doesn't mean we should shy away from them. And so I want to give thanks to Emory University and the Rollins School of Public Health for both giving the platform for these courageous exploration of these ideas. And I also want to pull what both Megan and Nat were saying, which is biology is us, not just us as a human species, but as our planet, as our climate, as our ecosystems. And now we're also seeing with information, it may be that information in some respects is moving from being inert to actually being in motion and actually having a life of itself. I won't say it's necessarily the same as biological life, but these interesting intersections as we go forward, we're beginning to understand more about our planet, more about our communities, more about ourselves, and ultimately the role that we can play. So again, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to both Natalie Barrett and Megan Palmer. You all have been amazing. And over to you, Niles and Michelle, for the final close.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Thank you, Megan and Natalie. I just want to make one sort of point, or two quick points. One, I just love the fact that you guys were able to distill all these complex topics into just some really practical ways that people can apply. I mean, look at some of the questions and just engagement. So I just really appreciate that. It's always great to see folks that have these amazing brains and ideas about this whole space, but can make it really practical for folks that this is not their forte. So kudos to that. And I just love this question of who sets strategy for public health. And that is really one of the reasons why this series was created, so that we can engage alum from Rollins, students from Rollins, as well as leaders like you all, to figure out what is that strategy? How can we have an influence? And I think this also echoes what Michelle said in the chat around Rollins's future 5-year strategic plan. And so they're trying to do exactly that and setting a course for Rollins, and I think this much broader ecosystem that is public health. So really appreciate the time today. We are going to send recordings and follow-up from today. There'll be additional information about this session if you weren't able to attend in person. And then look for more information about this series. We're looking to have another session sometime by the end of this calendar year that's getting into digital innovation and sort of the whole idea of what that looks like in the public sector, both domestically and abroad. So thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.